What do folks think? Looking pretty good for ballot 2.
Yeah, it does.
How many they got left to count? It's got just about done. I mean,
Yeah, I don't think statistically they can. It'll change much at this point. Pretty much every election is set at this point. There's going to be a recount in Anchorage in the Pruitt race.
Oh yeah. Weird.
But that's about it. Everything else is pretty much set.
What's the delta there? 16 votes in favor of Ms. Snyder.
Yep, 16 votes.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's close. Sure wish our Gross was closer. And Elise. That would have been something. Take away that 50-year-old young man. 50-year veteran. His time's up. Just wants to die in office. I think. Too much money.
I don't know. There's a persistent rumor floating around that Don Young would like to be finish out his 49th year in Congress and go out as the 49th year in the 49th state.
Brad, I think you're the one that calls for when we're ready to get going, unless we want to just get going here.
Yeah,
Well-
Stacia, you want to go with it?
Yeah, I was gonna wait till 7:05. We have had a few people who just entered, but that's now. So my name is Stacia McGordy. I am the Adult Services Coordinator for Anchorage Public Library. I want to thank everyone for coming in tonight. I know that election fatigue is very real, but I'm happy that you're all still interested in the subject of campaign finance. I'd like to start our evening by acknowledging the original inhabitants of this area, the Dena'ina people. The land that Anchorage is situated on is the traditional, sovereign, and unceded land of the Dena'ina. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Dena'ina people, past, present, and future. I also want to acknowledge our community partners and thank everyone for coming together to put this event on. We could not do this without a team of people for this particular event. That includes Move to Amend, Anchorage Public Library, Alaska Common Ground, and American Promise. Just a few things to go over before we get started with the discussion. This is a Zoom meeting, so all microphones are muted to eliminate background noise. You should definitely select speaker view for the best viewing experience, and go ahead and introduce yourself to the chat. If you have any questions during the program, put them in the Q&A. I'll be passing those off to our panelists, our moderator, as we go. Now, this meeting will be recorded, so there will be a link available for viewing later. And of course, any inappropriate conduct will result in removal. So with that done, I would like to introduce tonight's moderator. This discussion is going to be moderated by Brad Keithley, the Managing Director of Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. Brad, thank you for coming out and getting us started.
Stacia, thank you for having me, and thank you for the introduction. Good evening and welcome to our discussion this evening of campaign finance, states' rights, and the Constitution, where we are and how did we get here. I'm Brad Keithley, as Stacy said, the Managing Director of Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets and your moderator for the evening. I'm joined by speakers Jim Rubens, State Senator Scott Kawasaki, and Joe Geldhof, all of whom I will introduce further in a moment. This program is part of the Anchorage Public Library's ongoing series of virtual civic education and engagement. This evening's program in particular is the third in a series of discussions on the topic of campaign finance that have been hosted by the Anchorage Public Library in groups Alaska Common Ground, Alaska Move to Amend, and American Promise. The first two discussions in the series were Amending the Constitution, Mission Impossible. That was on September 17th. And the second was The Color of Money, a discussion on Dark Money, the movie, and lessons for Alaskans. That was on October 23rd. For those interested, I believe the videos of the first two discussions, of those two discussions, are available on the Alaska Common Ground YouTube page. Let me start with a bit of context for this evening's discussion. Prior to the Supreme Court's decision in 2010 in Citizens United versus Federal Elections Commission, both the federal government and many, if not all states, were engaged in the regulation not only of the disclosure, but also the amount and type of spending that could be made in the course of election activities. Alaska had extensive regulations on the subject, including some adopted by initiative. In the Citizens United decision in 2010, however, the Supreme Court held that the free speech clause of the First Amendment prohibited the government from restricting independent expenditures for political communications by corporations, including nonprofit corporations, labor unions, and other associations. Although only federal election activities were directly at issue in that case, in 2012, in a Montana case, the Supreme Court extended the rationale also to apply to state efforts at restricting and regulating such spending at a state level. Since that time, independent expenditures have grown exponentially, seemingly leapfrogging higher with each election cycle. While states have been able to regulate in some respects the terms of the disclosure of the incoming money, they have been prevented entirely from regulating the levels. While the numbers are still being tabulated from the most recent cycle, when finished, it appears that upwards of $100 million, or roughly $270 per Alaska voter, will have been spent in the 2020 Alaska election cycle among the two ballot measures, the US Senate and House races, and the state legislative races, a large portion of which will have been made through so-called independent expenditures coming from outside the state. With a US Senate, US House, governors, and with redistricting potentially up to 60 legislative races, as well as the every 10-year question on the ballot of whether Alaskans should call a constitutional convention, who knows what amounts may pour into the state from such entities in the 2022 and beyond that future cycles. Tonight's panel is going to discuss where we are on the ability to regulate and control such efforts, how we got to where we are, and the consequences, and perhaps most importantly, whether, and if so, what can be done about it from here. To do so, we've assembled an outstanding panel who are highly knowledgeable and active on the subject. Stepping up first will be national expert Jim Rubens, a former New Hampshire state senator and GOP party platform committee chair, who currently serves as a board member for American Promise and the New England chair of Take Back Our Republic, two groups actively involved on the issue. Following Jim will be former Alaska State Representative and current Alaska State Senator Scott Kawasaki, Democrat of Fairbanks, a sponsor of Alaska Senate Joint Resolution 16, which supports an amendment to the United States Constitution to overturn Citizens United. And then following Scott and taking a somewhat contrarian view will be Joe Geldhof, an attorney from Juneau, also a member of American Promise, and among other things, also a founder of the Permanent Fund Defenders. Our format will be for each speaker to provide about a 10-minute, in Jim's case, 15, since he's going to provide some additional background, of opening remarks, outlining their position on where we are, how we got here, and where we should be headed from here. After we finish that, then we'll provide about 20 minutes so that each speaker has the opportunity to follow up with questions to one or both of the other panelists. And then at the end, I'll pose some audience questions. Please contribute your questions during the discussion by posting them in the chat. We don't have a Q&A, so just use the chat room at the bottom of your screen. We'll close by 8:30. So with that, let me turn it over to Jim to kick things off with an overview from a national perspective of the issue, how we got here, where we are, and where we're headed from here. Jim?
Thank you. Thank you all for putting this on and being part of this, the participants. And congratulations on measure number 2. From the American Promise point of view, you became the 21st state in the United States to officially call for Congress to draft an amendment to the US Constitution, which would permit regulation of big money and to send it back to the states for potential ratification. So thank you, Alaska number 21, a lot. I know it was a close election. So I'm going to talk about this from a Republican point of view. And most of you are probably aware, D's and people on the progressive side are almost wholly behind some of these measures, including this measure, this what we're calling the 28th Amendment. And the support among Republicans in office is on the light side. So we've got to deal with this. So I'm going to start with Republicans now becoming aware that I'm a Republican, we're getting trounced by outside big money. And this has really happened since 2018. And I'll start with some very interesting data I found about 3 days ago from Brookings. Biden won, President-elect Biden won 490 counties in the US. Those counties are 70% of the US economy. So Biden was elected by counties in a majority, 70% of the economy. Trump won in 2,500 counties, accounting for 29% of the US economy. And that's down from 36% when Trump won in 2016. So you can see the mechanics here of the flow of money to Republicans, Democrats, right, left, progressive, conservatives, and the shift in the availability of money to Republicans. And again, we're on the losing side of this thing now since 2018, is driven by a very significant shift in the demographics and economy in the United States. Money is concentrated in areas, the economy is strong, people have different views as a result of that in counties where the economy is being buffeted by things like immigration, low wages, job exports. People have a very different view about the world. So again, 2018, the Democrats caught up with the Republicans in the big money game, the big outside money game. In 2018, Democrats outflanked Republicans 2-1 in dark money, one category of this money. As of mid-October 2020, that's the latest data we've got, Democrats and Democrat-aligned groups crushing Republicans, crushing by 2-1 in total spending. Now we got a huge surge in small donors, $200 and less, a record, huge. It's still 22% of the money raised. The balance of the money in this election, 14 billion, it's thought to be 78% of it is still big money. And this money this includes the small donor money. Most of this money is very concentrated. It comes from a small number of people who target, control, and direct the money. And this impacts, again, this impacts Republicans, particularly in states like mine, New Hampshire, yours, Alaska. This money is concentrated, determined, controlled by people who live in places like San Francisco, Manhattan, Chicago, and DC. And they have flooded this money, this outside money, into campaigns surgically targeted to swing districts, even down to state legislative races. I can give you my experience in New Hampshire. In 2018, Michael Bloomberg got involved in our Republican-controlled, this is 2018, New Hampshire, our Republican-controlled House and Senate. He flipped both of them to Democrat with his money. Texas, 2020, a handful of Democratic bigwigs raised $61 million to defeat 12 Texas state house members. These are not congresspersons in Texas. These are 61 million targeted to flipping the Texas House to Democratic control. And it didn't work only because the Republicans had a better ground game and better messaging than the Democrats in Texas. But this shows these buffeting influence. In Alaska, since 2010, Democrats and progressive people on the left overwhelmed the GOP with outside money 20-1. This is accumulated data, Alaska, 2010, post-Citizens United to now, 20-1 outside money favors Democrats on the left. Even Measure 2, which again, thank you for getting it passed, Alaska, 10-1 out of state to in-state money. And there's an impact on Republicans in Alaska because the targeting of that money, the surgical, careful targeting of that money that resulted in the win here on Measure 2, also wound up turning out voters in districts, purple districts, and resulted in taking out what Republicans in Alaska deemed to be good GOP incumbents. So it's a sore spot just for you folks in Alaska to be aware of this, that this great measure, which passed, it punished Republicans perhaps inadvertently. And I'll also say that the Democratic money advantage was likely the edge that defeated Donald Trump. And I refer you back to that 70% versus 20% of the counties in the US economy. So Democrats are now the high bidders in what we've got, a pay-to-play political system. And the Republicans no longer have their pre-2018 self-interest, which we did before 2018, in preserving the system. We no longer have that. And Republicans are discovering this and rethinking allegiance to Citizens United and owed some money. So what is the impact? And again, I'm talking from a Republican point of view. What is the major structural impact of this change that I just talked about? We live in a compound republic. We are the United States of America. We have power divided very carefully by the framers and the founders, very carefully divided to avoid tyranny, concentration of power. The states have certain powers. The federal government has certain powers, and the 10th Amendment to the US Constitution specifies that all powers not specifically delegated to the federal government are reserved respectively to the states or to the people. So we have a compound republic, powers primarily left to the states and to the people, not to the federal government. Now, what's happened with this concentrated money? Well, let's go back up a little bit. Why do Republicans like the 10th Amendment? Why should all Americans like it? Why do we all benefit from it? Because it guarantees respect for local preferences. It guarantees political space to test and replicate successful policies. We don't know the right thing to do in every case on major policies. We test them in the states. And it allows Americans to live in peace with one another despite our differences. We all know we have big differences. So our 10th Amendment is our protection against remote one-size-fits-all government. And again, I'm speaking from a Republican point of view, and as you're speaking to Republicans to bring them on board in this effort, which we need to do, you've got to think about this motivation. So, and the 10th Amendment is also designed to protect the voice of the people, because you in Alaska, you have greater access to people in your state capital, to your local House members and state senators. They're more responsive, they're closer to you. It's easier to meet them in supermarkets and checkout lines when those come back again. Hopefully they do quickly by March or June of this coming year. So these lessons of 2020 is this record-shattering amounts of non-candidate money, large individual donors, no limit super PACs, party line money, massive small donor, out-of-state money is flooding almost every state swing race, including down to state legislative races. And it's not the amount of dollars. And again, I'm speaking from a Republican point of view. We're less concerned about the amount of money than we are about the concentration of money, the concentration in a very small number of hands. And I include the small donor money because that's targeted too. And it results in this big money, small number of people picking candidates, homegrown candidates, locally funded candidates are getting overwhelmed. Campaign ads, increasingly funded by this money, have become more false, more misleading, more negative. The cost of ads for your in-state candidates using their own campaign money is driven up by this out-of-state money. And candidates lose control. Our candidates are losing control of their own messaging and their own ability to run campaigns. A debate over key issues is becoming narrowed, and issues are getting nationalized. Again, this is the impact of concentrated money. We're nationalizing more and more campaigns, and it's separating our candidates and our elected officials from the unique, varied, different, purposely so needs of our different states. That's not a good thing. So this is a danger, and I'm going back to the framers, Constitution. They were keenly concerned about concentration of power. It was probably the #1 concern they had in designing our form of government. Separating power, avoiding concentration, power checking power. And this system of big money we've got right now, this is a direct structural attack on federalism, states' rights, and the 10th Amendment. This really concerns Republicans. And when I've talked to Republicans in many states on this issue over many years, several years, and when I bring up, and this should be helpful to you folks, when you bring up specific in-state examples of out-of-state money sources coming in, picking candidates, taking out good incumbents, it causes Republicans to just fire up out of their chair in response and anger. This motivates. So that's item 2. Why is this happening? We just heard, introduction. This is Citizens United is pivotal. There are a variety of cases. And to talk about, and again, I'm talking to Republicans here who say that money equals speech, and no one should be limited in the ability. If you happen to be lucky enough to become wealthy, you should not be limited in your ability to use your money to speak. That's part of the freedoms of America. But look carefully at our Constitution. The Second Amendment does not permit brandishing a firearm to coerce or threaten someone. There's a limit on the Second Amendment, and Republicans accept that. The First Amendment does not permit things like libel, incitement to criminal activity. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. We all know about that. And then we go to the Citizens United decision of 2010. And I'm going to read you a quote from the decision. And this decision overturned 100 years of prior jurisprudence. There was no factual record of any kind for the CU court to make this finding. Quote, independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption. The appearance of influence or access will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy. This was a direct finding in the Citizens United decision because they acknowledged, the justices acknowledged there are limits to unlimited money, and the need to prevent corruption is one of those limits. They found, again, with no factual record, that there were no problems with the risk or perception of corruptions. Here's a poll from 2019. 86% of Democrats and 86% of Republicans believe that, quote, elected officials often do favors for big campaign donors. This is Rasmussen, 2019, Campaign Legal Center. These are both 2019 polls. In both of these polls, Americans rank political corruption as our nation's #1 most serious crisis level issue. So the court was dead wrong. So when you're talking to Republicans, you can remind me and Republicans that the Citizens United court acknowledged the need to have limits on endless sums of big money, concentrated money, when there's a purpose of limiting corruption or the perception of corruption. We can see it's endemic among the public. So this extreme concentration of non-voter power results in policy objectives differing from the public preferences, center, left, and right, in case after case. We live in a system where I mentioned policy is now going to the high bidder. So what to do about it? In closing, what I'm going to talk about here, the states have the power to repair this damage that I've described by ratifying an anti-corruption amendment. And it would restore, and this is the amendment that American Promise is working toward, and that Alaska became the 21st state to ask Congress to get cracking on. This amendment would restore to Congress and the states their historic powers to set reasonable limits on campaign money and to distinguish corporate, union, and other synthetic entity organizations from individual money. It doesn't say that the Congress of the states have to do anything specific. It simply returns the power to our states and our Congress to do something about this. That'll be another fight after the amendment gets passed. American Promise, we are the leading organization. We're totally, exclusively focused on mobilizing cross-partisan grassroots support to persuade Congress to send this amendment back to the states for full ratification. And our goal is July 4th, 2026. So it's important to recognize, as we're working to build this coalition bigger, we've got to have supermajorities, not just of voters, but of people in Congress to get behind this. And the left and right have different reasons for supporting this. Note that among the public, 66% of Republicans support this amendment. This is recent polling. We got a recent test in Oregon, 2020, a ballot initiative to restore to the Oregon legislature and local jurisdictions the power to set limits. This passed by 60%, even in the reddest counties in Oregon, Sherman County. Trump got 76% of the vote, and this ballot measure, got 61% of the vote in that county in Oregon, 78-22 Oregon-wide. Here's the problem. We've got in Congress HJ-Res 2, SJ-Res 51. These are the reform. These are the measures to bring this Amendment 28, Congress 2020. 256 of the co-sponsors, House and Senate, only 2 of them are Republicans. So there's this gap, this gulf between voting Republicans who live in the real world of being citizens, and those in elected office. So there's this huge gap. So the job we have as activists on this issue is to connect Republican voters who want this change. Supermajority of Republican voters want this 28th Amendment to restore limits. And people in office we're having a harder time on the right persuading, because people in office typically like the system that got them elected. So we've got hard work to do. And my advice to all folks working on this is to watch out as we get closer, watch out for Democrats evaporating on the issue, going backwards, because remember, this is a system that keeps incumbents in office, and work customizing and personalizing your message for Republicans to bring them on board. We got to do. So you network, find your way to get to face-to-face meetings with state level Republicans and federal level Republicans. And often it's going to be the case in a state like Alaska, like mine in New Hampshire, small states, a person that you know probably has a personal relationship with someone that you want to sit down directly and persuade and move, some Republican in office. So you can join American Promise, you can join Business for American Promise, you can join your local or state chapter, and you can meet with your DC delegations. And I'll stop there. And I thank you very much for your time.
Jim, thank you. A quick question. Who are the 2 Republicans? A quick question from the audience. Who are the 2 Republicans that are supporting the amendment?
Yeah, forgive me, I'd have to look that up. One of them is a rural Syracuse, New York State Republican who, a leading Democrat who also favors this, a congressman, spent a lot of organizing effort. He's in Massachusetts, targeting this poor Republican, one of 2 Republicans getting behind this to take him out of office. So, but fortunately, he survived the election in New York State, still in office. So
Right.
I'll look that up and I'll post it online.
Great. Scott, one of those Democrats who may be backsliding? No. Someone who can explain how we've gotten to this point at the state level, what we're doing about it at the state level. Certainly ballot measure 2 is part of that, and where we go from here from an Alaska perspective.
Great, thanks Brad. Thanks. I appreciate the time. You know, I was just looking at the amount of mail that I received over the last couple weeks. I just wanted to show you there's mailers here, mailer here about, let's see, corporate lobbyists. This comes from the American Federation, AFSCME, of state, county, and municipal employees. One from the Plastics Council, another one from Paid For by One Nation. I have no idea who that group is, but it's obviously a pro-Sullivan group. So if you've checked your mail in the last couple of weeks, you've probably been disturbed at how much mail comes to you here in Alaska. And I'll just say that, you know, as an Alaskan, I, I respect the right of free speech, obviously, and want to make sure that folks have that right. In Alaska, though, especially in a place where it's inexpensive to advertise, we've had just an amazing amount of outside mailers come into Alaska. And that's where, you know, where I've got a problem. And since Citizens United, we've introduced a resolution every year calling for states to say that free speech doesn't extend to the rights of corporations. And again, these are corporate mailers from corporate donors. As Brad mentioned earlier, I think that there was almost $100 million spent in this little tiny state of Alaska with 700,000 people. And it's a real challenge for, say, a young candidate running for office to get out there and to say that we're running for something. This is what we're running for, because they're drowned out by the sheer amount of dollars that are spent on these elections. Ballot Measure 2 is sort of an example, and I know there's supporters of Ballot Measure 2 that are out there online right now, but Ballot Measure 2, $7 million was from out-of-state funds. They probably raised a couple $100,000 for Ballot Measure 2. It will now be law in the next election cycle. So one of the things that we've done here in the legislature since Citizens United has been to ensure that we know where the money comes from. And in 2012, we introduced law that basically said, we want to know where the money comes from. We want to know how it's spent. So we introduced a series of sunshine laws through the Senate and through the House. They ended up passing with bipartisan support. The big thing was if a company or a business wants to put money into a campaign, we would know where that money comes from. So now, if you're from Alaska, you recognize that the paid for by, the top 3 contributors are. We even changed the law to anticipate if a company or a business or some entity wanted to change the name of the business and say, well, we're going to create an LLC specifically designed to say, like, Alaskans for a Better Tomorrow, that it's funded by. Who is it funded by? Because we really want to know where the money's come from and how that's impacting an election. So we passed that in 2012. It passed overwhelmingly in both houses, and that law is now the law of the land. Obviously, we saw some folks who stretched that limit, and I think that those probably will go to court as far as how they use their names and who really paid for the elections results. Wanted to mention that as a local elected official, that and I think this goes for not just me, but for Republicans, for Democrats, for folks that are all across the aisle, that we don't want to have money in politics. Fundraising is the worst part of running for office. And when you have a Democrat or Republican in an opposite district, or a district that's really challenging for them, they don't want to have to spend all their time raising money. And I can just tell you that as a politician myself, when I ran in this district for the Senate, I raised more money than a Democrat has ever raised in a campaign for a state Senate seat running against the president of the Senate. And I didn't want to waste my time doing that. I would rather talk about the issues and lead. And so, I think that most legislators would agree that, yeah, we don't want to spend all of our time raising money every year. We can start raising money basically 8 months after you were elected to the state Senate or state House. And do you really want to spend all your time doing that? Or do you want to spend your time doing leadership and leading? And so again, I feel that most of these folks do not want to spend time trying to raise money just to be reelected so that they can come back and do more work. So that's why the Citizens United and campaign finance reform is such a big issue here in Alaska. You know, when I started running and when folks started running a dozen years ago, a campaign typically would raise $30,000 or $40,000 a year. Now you're talking about twice that or 3 times that with the money that comes out from independent expenditures. We've seen a growth here, especially in Alaska, because it's a cheap market. You can spend a little bit of money and flip a house. You can spend a little bit of money and pass ballot measure 2, for instance. You could spend a little bit of money and change the course of taxation when it comes to oil and gas, which was one of the issues that came up this year. Again, it was a $30 million race for oil and gas. 26 million came from outside contributions, obviously from mostly oil and gas companies, and a small fraction came from donors here in Alaska. So it's an important thing to think about as we move forward, as far as what kind of a state do we want? What kind of a local community do we want? Again, running for office, having the experience of running for office and knowing that money matters, it matters. And we see these small fundraisers from door to door just get trounced by outside money coming in from third-party groups. And there's got to be a way outside of that. I think that the way out of it is to really identify what we do with Citizens United to roll back the amount of cash that comes in from corporations. So I just wanted to end there and allow for some, I guess there's going to be questions, and we'll also hear from Joe here in a little bit.
Thanks, Scott. Great summation of where we are at the state level. Joe, you get to be the contrarian here and explain why we should have $100 million. And you probably need to disclose you're representing Channel 2 when you talk about. No, I'm kidding. But when you're talking about that, it certainly does benefit Channel 2. But Joe, you're up.
All right. Well, thank you, Brad Keithley. First, I want to thank everybody who's listening in on this. There's a number of participants. I'm delighted to see dozens of people listening in. And meetings like this and discussions like this are really the foundation of preserving our democracy on whatever side you come down on this. And for those of you participating, you don't have election fatigue, and thank you very much for tuning in. Our electoral politics is really where, to use an old metaphor, the rubber hits the road. And finding the right balance between having people walk around and talk to voters, having forums, using ads, sending out brochures where they talk about issues, and balancing that with the funds necessary to participate in those activities is actually what we're really talking about in terms of the money in politics and speech. And finding that balance in some ways has eluded the judiciary. Now, that's not surprising to anybody who's been in the court system or as an advocate or a judge in some ways, because the judicial system is probably not particularly well suited, given the people that are judges, to deal with the rough and tumble of electoral politics. And the contrarian in me, though, wants to say similar to what Scott Kawasaki said, corporations don't really exist, and unions don't really exist. And these other, as Jim Rubens said, synthetic organizations, non-people organizations don't exist basically to fool around in the world of politics. I mean, that's not how most of them are constituted and their primary mission. Why do they do it? And why do corporations feel it's critical to participate in the political system? And we're going to leave aside whether they overcommit funds and how they do that and whether they report it properly. But the point I'd like to make is corporations and unions and these other synthetic organizations that we've been talking about only do it to protect what they believe is their self-interest. Now, we could have a debate about whether this organization or that organization is trying to promote bad public policy, but there's a little bit of analogy to, the big arms race during the Cold War, where we don't have 1,000 nuclear bombs, we have 5,000 or 10,000, and but people acquire weapons, and we've weaponized money in politics because the decisions our politicians make matter, and you can debate which side we should do on that. But the money has flowed into politics from synthetic organizations, whether they're trade unions that I work with or corporations that I sometimes work with, because they have a stake in this and it's their vital interest. So how can we get back to finding the balance? And as Scott Kawasaki correctly points out, everybody's mailbox is plugged. Scott keeps them, I guess, as trophies or something. They go right to the recycling bin for me, for the most part. I skim them over. And Senator Kawasaki, here's a potential. Why don't we levy a tax on all the brochures? I mean, that'll help balance the budget down in, Juneau or wherever we're going to meet to take up the budget. But, I'm being a little facetious here, but my central point, and one that comes up over and over again when I listen to people who participate in this, and I'm leaving aside the extraordinary people like, everybody wants to talk about the Koch brothers. I don't. I think they are, they have had an outsized influence in the way that they've bundled money and the way they participate in our electoral system. But you can get all wigged out about the Koch brothers and a select group of rich people, whether they're Democrat-oriented or Republican or just libertarian buccaneers. But my central point that we need to remember as we go forward and address a political system awash in money are two things. One, people only do it because they perceive it as their self-interest, and they're not wrong about that. And they want to either protect things or advance things. And the second thing that is critical to remember, huge amounts of this vast money washing over our political system is wasted. And as a Republican who believes in smaller government and the leanest kind of government, it just really offends me how much we waste. When I was younger, as a teenager doing politics, the whole cadre of consultants and media people that were around electoral politics, especially the retail side of it, it was a cottage industry. Now it's a full-time, 24/7, full-blown industry. And there's an insatiable demand for money, as Senator Kawasaki brought up. The dirty secret, though, is most of it's wasted. And we've gotten to the point where the Republicans are now getting outspent. The Democrats are spending all their time raising money. And the citizens they're supposed to represent, we don't talk about issues anymore. We don't get the job done. And we have lost our way. So I'll just kind of conclude, because I really want to hear from the people listening in on this, their questions to the panel. I'll just say what's really at stake here, even more than a legal decision that was probably wrongly decided and conflated speech with giving money by entities that are not human beings. What's really at stake, though, is who's going to run this big, beautiful state that we live in Alaska? And the same goes for Wyoming or New York or or New Hampshire, any of the other states of the United States. We are barely united, and it's time to return decision-making about how we run our elections back to the state houses, whether it's Tallahassee or Concord or Cheyenne or any other state. And the states are the place to find the balance. But while we're finding that balance, we shouldn't overlook the fact that not every corporation is a big, oil and gas that you think is evil. There are small corporations where people are participating, and they should have a say in how state laws are written and even how national laws are written. So I'll kind of stop there. And the last thing I would say is thanks again to everybody who's listening in, because this is the most vital aspect of preserving and protecting our democracy, getting the information and then acting upon it so that we can continue this democratic experiment. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. One of the aspects of how we've set up this debate is to allow the panelists to ask each other questions. They're probably the most knowledgeable about these issues and best positioned to sort of raise additional issues and probe some of the statements made. So we're going to go through a round of allowing the panelists to ask each other questions before we turn to audience questions. Jim, you get to go first, and you can identify who you want to ask and what you want to ask them.
Unmute myself and ask the other panelists. You folks are on the ground in Alaska, and the question arises, and this is a question that I confront whenever I go into various states and work and help folks, is who are the Republicans in office, particularly at the state level, where you can begin, who will take a good meeting and have a good quality, frank conversation on this money and politics issue. And you don't need to name them perhaps publicly here, but if you care to, that'd be great. But write them down and get those meetings and have frank conversations. Make sure that this is not a question, it's more this advice again, but who are those people? Get people in the room who will create frank conversations. There are going to be people you're going to find in your network with whom frank conversations will be required, expected, and will happen. Find those people, network your way in. Who are those members, those elected members of the Alaska legislature that you're going to start with?
Scott, let me sort of rephrase that a little bit and put part of the question to you. You're the author, one of the co-authors of SJR 16, which is the resolution in the last legislature to ask for a constitutional amendment that would overturn Citizens United. The other co-authors are all Democrats. There isn't a Republican co-author on SJR 16. Yeah. Did you reach out to Republicans, and what was the response you got, if you did? And there was, to my recollection, there wasn't a companion in the House. So can you discuss a little bit about what you think as a former House member, can you discuss a little bit about what you think may be going on in the House in that regard?
Sure, Brad, and thank you, Jim, for the question. I'll just say that, I've been working on a campaign finance reform bill for a while, and I am drafting one right now. I asked the newest member of the legislature, who's from the Fairbanks area in North Pole, the new Senate member who beat Senator Coghill, if he'd be interested in the bill. So yeah, we reach out all the time to members on both sides of the aisle. Again, when in my initial comments, the comment was that none of us love raising money. This is not what we plan to do. We plan to change people's lives and change our state and improve it. But fundraising is not something that legislators love to do. I'll just say that my initial conversation with the member is that he's got an open mind. We'll work on it together. We talked about Citizens United. I told him about this meeting that we would have tonight with Alaska Common Ground, and I don't know that he was convinced 100%, but I think that he's willing to listen, and that's what's happened so far as reaching out to folks across the aisle. We have a bunch of new members in the legislature, and I think it's going to be talked about, at least when they hear how much money has actually flowed into the state from out-of-state groups. Again, the other thing is that these are people who won their elections based on perhaps money that came from out of state or came from other sources that are not local. So it's a real challenge. I get money from out of state. I benefited from the money that came from out of state personally. So it's a real challenge and a real head scratcher as far as like, well, how's this going to impact me in the future and future elections? But there are people, again, that they purely want to see an electoral process where it is the best ideas win. And you go down to Juneau, you change things for the better for the folks that are in your district, and that's it. So that's, I guess that's something, that I just wanted to mention. Two is that, until we get a hold of how much money is coming into the state, because there's these independent expenditures that nobody knows about. Not even the candidate knows about how much money comes into the state. Until we get a hold on that and the transparency that comes with it, it's going to be a real challenge for folks to deny money coming into the state, benefiting themselves. So I think that's where we can start.
Bev Churchill points out that there is a companion over in the House, HJR 24. I looked it up quickly. There's no Republican co-sponsors on that either. There is a provision in ballot measure 2, as Jim's pointed out, that does call on, it says, supporting an amendment to the United States Constitution allowing citizens to regulate the raising and spending of money in elections. Do you take that as sort of completing the job of SJR 16 and really superseding it, or do you think there is more that needs to be done in the next legislature in formalizing that from that call from the legislature?
It's a process of showing states readiness to get on board when this goes back to the states, for the 38 states, for subsequent potential ratification. It shows readiness, and we've seen over the history of the 27 constitutional amendments that Congress sees the light when they feel the heat. You've heard that expression before. They feel the wind at their back when sufficient numbers of states become active and express their views. But you need to get members of Congress, your 2 senators and House member, to get on board. That's hard to do, and you've got to work your way up the food chain to do that. So this expression of intent by the people of Alaska is not the end game. It's just a route. It's a vehicle. It's part of the pathway of getting to the required number of 60% and 3/5 of members of Congress to draft and approve the amendment. So we've got to work our way up the food chain, and this vote by Alaska citizens is working your way there. Got to get to your members of Congress. Got to have meetings with them. Got to persuade them. Got to show them that Republicans want this. Supermajority of Republicans want this. Frank meetings. It's a vehicle. It's a pathway to get to those meetings and get to yes.
That's great. Scott, picking up from that, Scott, do you see a role for the legislature this next session in pushing something like the Senate Joint Resolution again, or do you see a different approach now that you have this language in ballot measure 2? Do you see a different approach in the legislature next session to push forward?
Yeah, so, as you know, Brad, about a quarter of the legislature is brand new. And they had to go through the situation of running, raising money, putting themselves out there. And so, you know, they're going to be ripe for what, you know, I mean, sort of what the expectations are coming forward. And again, like I said, legislators do not want to run just to raise money for the next election cycle. They want to legislate. They want to do things. And I think that it's open for folks who want to run for office and continue to run for office, that they don't want a lot of money in politics. So I've worked with some of the newer members who are coming in about this, about the move to amend issue, and then about campaign finance reform in general. And I think the time is now to talk about it. People are looking at their mailboxes full of mailers from groups that they never knew spent money on their race or against them in their races. So it's really time to sort of get that discussion going, and I think we're going to have some movement on that.
Okay, Scott,
Yeah,
thank you.
Can I jump in and kind of loop back to Jim's original question and some things that Scott said? So one of the keys towards getting any legislator, Republicans or Democrats, is finding what motivates them. And a long time ago, I learned from a congressman back in DC who had this simple formula. He said, you know, politics is, in dealing with politicians, it's sort of a stimulus response mechanism that motivates people. And a big part of that is actually fear when you're dealing with either an individual politician or the group known as Republicans or Democrats or some caucus. But so what's my point? Politicians are actually pretty good, if they last a cycle or two, at reading people, and they quickly evaluate people. And it comes down to kind of a binary principle. If I adopt this position, will it help me or hurt me? Will it help my constituents or hurt? And finding the right mechanism with Republicans or Democrats, where they'll say, oh, this will help me, this will help my constituent, this will help my state, this will help my community. You got to have a carefully honed message. Now, to go back to the fear thing, a lot of Republicans haven't really got the memo yet that the money that's awash in politics has flipped from favoring Republicans to Democrats. Right. And speaking as a Republican, I keep reminding them, you know, we're in this mutually assured destruction, and now we're being outgunned, and most of it's just wasted anyway. So let's get real here and ramp back money so that issues and votes become ascended again. Because those are really the only three things that really matter in politics. You can quibble with me or what, but it's, if you have votes, your vote, or you can bundle votes, if you have information and an issue that makes sense and you can articulate it, or you have, for lack of a better term, some money, those are the three things that really are kind of the currency that politicians and lobbyists trade in. What we have now is a hugely imbalanced system where money matters more than anything else. And it's ruining our democracy. And it's ruining our democracy whether you're a corporation or an LLC or a union, you know, whether you're a shop owner or a partnership or just an individual citizen. And that's why we have to figure out how the Supreme Court, which lost its way, they really lost their way and conflated speech and money and corporations and individuals. And we've got to basically, and it's not really shocking. I mean, they're all nice people and they went to really great schools, and you know, none of them have really been in politics. They've never even had a real job, most of them, you know, other than an internship or something. So the citizens, and that's the people who are listening to this, you've got to take control here and convince the Republicans and the Democrats to get the system rebalanced. And I'll stop there.
Now, remember, Joe, you're the contrarian. You're supposed to be in favor of money coming into the system.
Well, I take your point there, Mr. Moderator here. But the fact of the matter is, most corporate people, you know, if you get them after, you know, one glass of sparkling water or 3 martinis or whatever you're drinking and everything, they basically hate the whole thing because they get shook down because they've got more money. Corporate people would rather be building airplanes or, digging up the ground mining or something like that. They only give money because they think they have to.
So your point would be that Scott doesn't want to go out fundraising, and the corporations don't want to be hit up by fundraising. There's no mutually assured destruction. They both need to keep building because the issues keep coming up because the other guy isn't restricted.
Yeah, we're all, if you're involved in politics at any level, we're all like gerbils on the rotary wheel, and we're running around and it's going faster and faster, and it's not benefiting local governments, state governments, or our nation. I mean, we have lost our way.
Scott, your turn for a question.
Well, let's see. I guess I'll pose a question to either Joe or Jim. What, absent a change constitutionally, what are options for us locally to ensure that we know where the money's coming from, and that the money that comes to the state of Alaska isn't utilized so that it really impacts the election outside of what the locals want?
I got to be skeptical about that. I'm strongly in favor of transparency, reporting. People ought to know where the money come from, but it's not. You got to be frank. It's not going to fix the problem until concentrated money can't buy policy anymore and corrupt the system. Even if it's fully disclosed, the system is not going to get fixed. I think that this amendment we're talking about here, the 28th Amendment, to restore to Congress and the states the power to put limits on concentrated money, there's no substitute for it. It's the root of our dysfunction in our republic, our inability to solve problems. And I've seen disclosure. I've seen how it works in my state and other states. It doesn't stop the problem, and voters are not massively. If a voter learns that the Koch brothers funded a candidate, it doesn't have much of an impact on election outcomes. This is the transparency question. I'm throwing cold water on that. States should do this. I strongly encourage you to do it. It is helpful. Some voters want to know it. Voters should know about it.
Joe, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, the transparency issue comes up all the time. And for example, I think the jurists, including the Supreme Court that ruled in Citizens United, they assumed that transparency was be all end all, and that if the electorate just had enough information, everything would be just ducky. Right. Well, even if you assume that's true, which I do not, because there's too much evidence that pure transparency doesn't exist, and it doesn't really afford the electorate with sufficient information to make considered choices. How you do that in terms of timing, there's an endless series of evasions and creating new corporations, and create this one, and then the money flows over here and everything, and just tracking that money in a timely fashion is brutally difficult. And if you think that's wrong, think about how many people know that half the food you buy really isn't probably very good for you. Well, we've got labeling requirements and everything. We've got labeling requirements on tobacco and stuff like that. It doesn't really change behavior for many people. Now, maybe, if you're a libertarian or a pure libertarian, maybe you think that's just fine. But I think we're dealing with our democracy in Alaska. And isn't the issue, shouldn't we have the ability to say we want no rules, or we want these rules, or, as long as they don't completely eradicate the ability for people to participate, shouldn't we as Alaskans be able to set the standard? I mean, if Nevada wants to say all bets are off, you can do anything you want, fine. And if you like that, move to Nevada. But, in Alaska, we have had decent reporting rules. We have had decent limits that were struck by our elected officials, and they were just wiped out and eviscerated by 5 people, 4 time zones removed, wearing black robes, none of whom have ever held elected office, and they actually don't know very much about politics. I'm not big on a one-size-fits-all rule driven by 5 people just because they're US Supreme Court members. I think we in Alaska should be making our rules, and that we'll do a good job setting them so that they'll work for our state and our municipalities.
So we need to move to audience questions here in a minute, but Joe, you have the opportunity for a question of Scott and Jim before we do. You put yourself on mute, Joe.
Yeah, to Jim Rubin, who's 4 time zones away, but has followed this all over. What's the biggest single impediment? Is there a common denominator on why people are just to acquiesce to Citizens United? Why they don't want local control? However that plays out. What's the big holdup?
Almost everyone wants local control. This is I spent a lot of time on federalism. That's a touchstone of people across the spectrum, particularly for conservative Republicans who don't want people in Washington and New York determining how you use your land and your salmon in Alaska. It really pisses people off in Wyoming and New Hampshire when Michael Bloomberg comes in and takes out pro-gun members of our state Senate in New Hampshire in 2018. It pisses. This is how you're going to move Republican minds. Getting to brass tacks. You've do your research. I'm going to repeat this. Do your research. Find out what moves, motivates, angers your target at your meeting. It could be a mailer they got telling a lie about them, something to get them to rise up out of their chair and say, "Damn it, I'm with you on this now. I can't take this anymore." You've got to personalize. You got to do research. This is what we got to do. We got to bring people across the spectrum on board. Over in Pennsylvania, the Wolf Pack working on the Article 5 approach to the same amendment, the 28th Amendment. You folks all know about Wolf Pack. I'm part of American Promise, but I was working for Wolf Pack 3 or 4 years ago. They got the Wolf Pack bill with a majority of members, most of whom were Republicans in both the House and Senate, to co-sponsor the bill. It got killed by leadership in the bodies. So I'd advise folks, when you're putting bills in and you're working to find support, balance things. For every Democrat you bring aboard, make certain you bring a Republican aboard, or do it like Pennsylvania, where they made it all Republicans. Then the Democrats were persuaded in the background, lay low. We're going to work to make this a Republican branded issue. Republicans don't want to be, the last single person to climb aboard a Democratic bill. They're not going to do that. It's very uncomfortable. You're going to get primaried when you do that. That's not the question you asked me, but I've got to give you that advice, because we got to get to the 28th Amendment, and the way to do it, we've got to have members of the Alaska members, probably 2 out of 3 of them on board. You're 3 people. Got to get them on board.
Well, let's ask a couple of questions and get the audience somewhat involved in this. Yeah. One is looking at the money that came in this last cycle. There was a lot of money that came in for ballot measure 2. It barely passed. More money, much more money, came in for the independent side, both in the Senate race and in the House race, than on the incumbent side, than on the R side. But yet the R's won. Are we overestimating the significance of money in politics? Yes, it results in a lot of mailers. Yes, it results in a lot of TV advertisements that get in the way of football games. Yes, it results in a lot of dollars spent and a lot of boots on the ground. But are we overestimating it? Because our last election cycle would show that perhaps it's not the determining factor.
I mentioned the Texas situation. $61 million to take out 12 members of the Texas state house. Didn't work. Not a one of them fell down. It doesn't always work, but it can be decisive. I credit Trump's loss, President Trump's loss, to the overwhelming sums of money raised on the left in this election. And you know, Republicans, you know, we're the freedom party. We believe in liberty. I don't want to say that people on the left or Democrats don't, but this is a touchstone of Republican philosophy. So it's a tougher sell for Republicans by virtue of the notion that people should be able to do what they want with their own life as long as they're not hurting someone else. So you've got to persuade Republicans. Again, we're hurting ourselves. We're on the losing end of this thing now, we Republicans, and it's hurting our republic. It's preventing us from solving problems. It's preventing conservatives from doing things that conservatives want to do, like having fiscal responsibility, just as one example. So it's a harder sell on the right, but it is sellable.
So Scott or Joe, any thoughts about whether or not money, we may be overstating the significance of money?
Well, I sort of made that pitch before, and I won't belabor it, but there's a tremendous waste of the financial resources. And, you know, one of the best things you can learn if you're actually involved in politics for a while is a good candidate with a good message and adequate resources, which can be volunteers and signs and money, whatever, will always beat a dim bulb candidate with a goofball message and tons of money. And if you don't believe that, there's a million examples. I mean, I worked with people on an initiative 15 years ago, and we spent on the campaign almost $8,000, and we were outspent a lot, like $1.5 million in reported legal money, and we still won. That was the cruise ship initiative in 2006. And the only reason we won is because the public liked what we developed. And we knew that because we had focus grouped it and stuff like that. We weren't too far ahead of the public. We had a good message. It was well delivered, and the other side had tons of money, and they mostly just wasted it. So, you know, we saw that in this last election. You know, candidate Gross had so much money, he was like sending out brochures that arrived 2 days after the election. They could have just taken it right to the dump and burned all of it. It didn't matter. So.
Yeah, and Joe's right. I think that a good person who's running a great campaign and who has the right message can sometimes win against a person who's got more money. But also, I'll just say that it's a challenge when you're outspent 2-1, and there's a couple races here in Alaska in which, like local House races, the person was the right fit. They ran as an independent. They spent the same amount of money against a Republican opponent, but then also got trounced by out-of-state money that they didn't see coming. That's where, we really have to say that, is this out-of-state money or this dark money coming in the right thing for Alaska, the right thing for the rest of the states. So I do definitely agree with Joe that you have to have a good candidate first, and you've got to have a good message. And if things were on par and both folks were absolutely, 50-50, this is a good guy, this is a good guy, this is a good person, this is a good person, they ran against each other, what is that, the coin toss, what's the flip? And if there's money coming in, then that's the thing that turns the race.
I've seen data showing that a money advantage can provide a 2 or 3%, not massive, but a 2 or 3% edge if you have a big money advantage. Not decisive, but enough in a close situation. I ran an anti-casino operation campaign in New Hampshire for 9 years. We were outspent every year in the legislature, state issue, by the casino lobby, 100-1. We won every single one of the 9 years by out-organizing them. The coalition building, keep probing, find people who are allies, unusual suspects who might be on your side. And if you keep doing that, you can beat a money advantage. You have to work harder, you have to think harder, you have to coalition build more intensively, more thoughtfully, more creatively. And we are at a disadvantage on this issue. The money interests are not going to go lightly and let Amendment 28 get into law. So recognize this, that we're going to have to be smarter. We're going to have to out-organize. We're going to have to out-network. We're going to have to outthink the opponents. But we're on the right side of history on this. We have to do this so that our republic can start solving its problems again.
One of the
Let me
questions. Go ahead.
Just one other point about the recent election up here. One way of evaluating ballot measure 2, people say, oh, it was outside money, it was close. It actually, I'll tell you what it is. It reflects a lot of Alaskans, some Republicans, probably a lot of Democrats, and a lot of independents who are basically tired of the establishment parties and the bickering and the fighting, and they want change. And they want a different system, both in terms of how we do primaries, maybe how we vote, and they want change. That's my overall observation. And that's an environment where people who are interested in promoting restrictions or creating an opportunity where money is not just flooding the system from outside, you can remind them of that. The electorate wants change. So who are you not to get in the way? Let's give it to them.
One of the questions is pretty direct, and it says, what will it take Don Young to get on board? And presumably that means Don Young and Lisa and Sullivan as well. Let me sort of turn that a little bit. Jim, you say that Alaska is the 21st, 22nd state to articulate a desire to have a constitutional amendment, that we did that in ballot measure 2. Are any of the other states Republican? Are any of the others? They must be red, because they're to get to 21, you've got to have some red states.
Yeah, no.
And what has motivated in those states for those states to get behind it? And is that carrying through to their congressional delegation? Is their congressional delegation showing some response to that in terms of their activity of pushing the constitutional amendment at the federal level?
Yeah, most of the states, Alaska 21, most of the states are on the blue side, definitely on the blue side. Those are the easier lifts for us in this effort. We're now probing into states like Wyoming, where we've got a good shot, for example. Very red state, but the mood is there to do this. We did that in New Hampshire. We're a purple state. We were a red state at the time, and it had to go through our legislature in New Hampshire. So we had to get not people who vote, but people who are in office. Those are the harder sells, harder to get. And we had very, very good support among elected members of the body when we adopted. We were state number 20 in New Hampshire, a purple state, purple leaning red at the time. So it's getting harder.
There's a lot of similarities between Wyoming and Alaska. What arguments are working in Wyoming, and why do you think it's moving forward in Wyoming?
Federalism. I can tell you from going into talking to Republicans, conservatives, going into red states, the idea that the left wing from California and San Francisco can come into your state, particularly small states, target swing districts, and take members out of office if they're pro-gun, or other issues that motivate Republicans. It really pisses Republicans off when that happens. Seriously pisses them off. And those who remain in office have seen their peers get taken out. Those who have lost races can be and are motivated by that. So I begin with this. I have other arguments, but federalism, the 10th Amendment, outside money coming in and determining how you should run your state, what issues are talked about, all issues being nationalized, that motivates. And you can work with that in a place like Alaska, Texas, Wyoming.
So Joe, do you see there are opportunities for, and I'll ask Scott too, but Scott on the D side, Joe, do you see opportunities for that on the Alaska side? Do you see Alaska legislators, Joe, as having the potential to take that on as an issue?
Well, I do, and the ask right away, you have to, what's your ask? And you say, look, are we going to continue as Republicans are we going to continue letting the folks from Silicon Valley and the money boys from New York run our state?
Right.
And you have to, they get your attention from fear, and then you provide your solution. If you're dealing with Congressman Young, who's the congressman for all Alaska, if not every Alaskan, you have to say, look, you're the dean of the House. Part of your legacy is to make sure that Alaskans run the money part of politics according to our standards as passed by our folks here. And you go right into what Jim Rubens was talking about, the federalism argument, that we in Alaska are, right or wrong, we should be determining how our elections are conducted, including the money part of it. And that's how you get people like Congressman Young. He gets that in terms of guns. He gets that in terms of land use. Why wouldn't he get it in terms of elections? But somebody's got to ask, and you got to start out with something that gets his attention and just doesn't wallow around in the usual, liberal tropes and stuff like that. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. So an analysis of this election cycle and the potential impact. I mean, I've heard a lot of discussion among friends about how they believe the legislative outcomes were influenced by the amount of money that were coming in, frankly, for the independent side in the Senate race for ballot measure 2, and the steps they were taking to gather ballots, gather absentee ballots, do ballot chases on absentees, that had a big impact on the down ballot and had a big impact on the fact that the R's are fading, shall we put it that way, as the absentees are counted on the down ballot races. Some analysis of that and tying that to the amount of money that came in and suggesting that the R's are going to be at a disadvantage at the state level if they continue down this road.
So let me just say, I want to add to what Joe mentioned. I mean, the difference is that the folks that invest money in the state are typically conservative group or, conservative leaning groups. So oil and gas spends money in the state. Mining groups spend money in the state. Social justice groups don't spend money in the state as much. And so, I hope that legislators of both, both conservative and liberal legislators will think that, yeah, we just want to pull the money out of the state. But I think it's a tougher deal for Republican members of the legislature now to say that, yeah, we want to pull money out of the state because they benefited from it. They benefited from it locally. Look at the Alaska Family Council, again, oil and gas groups that spend a lot of money on ballot measure 1, mining groups that typically invest in Republicans rather than Democrats, the NRA, which still has a huge force here, which typically, I mean, there might be like one Democrat that they endorsed last year, and that's this year, and that was Bill Wielechowski. But it's typically tipped to the Republican side, so they're going to have to say that we want to sacrifice that money and those funds that come in and endorsements and things like that. So it's different here in Alaska.
Well, we could stay at this all night. There's questions have piled up, and we could continue on with questions all night. But we've hit the witching hour, the 8:25 time, which I think I am committed to turn it back to Stacia to do the wrap up and let the sponsors have a word or two. Thank you to the panel. Thank you, Jim, for taking the time. We especially appreciate you doing this, given the 4-hour time difference. You look to be in your prime, a little bit after midnight there. Scott, thank you for taking the time. And it's a great kitchen. We really enjoy you showing your kitchen. And Joe, you have the best lighting of anybody. So thank you for taking the time as well. With that, Stacia, let me turn it back to you for the wrap up.
All right, I want to thank everybody for coming out. I want to thank our panelists for coming and speaking with us. I know it's really interesting with the time differences, but my pandemic silver lining is it is so much easier to get people together for a virtual event like this. So I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank everyone who came and watched and participated in the discussion. We could not do anything without you. Again, I want to thank our partners. I want to make sure everyone has a chance to talk a little bit about what it is they do. I'll start us off. Anchorage Public Library, we are here for you. We provide books, research, movies. Fun fact, this week we started checking out MiFi. So if you need to boost your internet at home, put a MiFi on hold and check it out from your local library. They're awesome and really easy to use. So if you have any information need, just see us at www.anchoragelibrary.org and we would be happy to help you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kari at Alaska Common Ground.
I don't know if Kari is here, Stacia.
I'm right here.
Oh, there she is.
I'm right here. And
Okay.
I had to try to improve my lighting to, thank you all for coming. We were delighted to partner with these other organizations. Alaska Common Ground, our goal is an engaged Alaska democracy. So we're just trying to make sure that everyone is engaged in the process. We host all kinds of events. We hosted a couple of events on the ballot measures most recently, and the ballot measure 2 event was a fabulous discussion that hopefully many of you were able to join. And I know personally it helped me make a decision on how I wanted to vote on that. You can find out a lot more at akcommonground.org, and hopefully you will come to future events. I'll hand it over to you, Beverly.
Okay, thank you. Move to Amend is really pleased to have sponsored this event. I've been learning a lot. We have to keep working together to find common goals and strategies, because this is a big boulder that we're pushing uphill. But I think we all agree that it's very important for our democracy. Move to Amend has been in Alaska for since 2012. We are basically grassroots. We are working in communities to provide education on this topic. We are working with communities to pass resolutions to get to build that support. Like Jim said, working up the food chain. So we've been able to have several communities pass resolutions. So we are building that support from the ground root up, but we need help. We can't do it alone, and we don't want to do it alone. This has to be owned by all Alaskans that are concerned about our democracy. So we hope that we will continue to work with other organizations. We hear the message about continuing to work with the legislature, working on how to reach the congressional delegation, and we have to have more Republicans on board. So we thank you all, and we still have a lot of work to do. And I don't know who's on next. Let's see, we've got all the libraries, Common Ground. I think, is that it?
American Promise.
There we go. Who's the speaker for American Promise?
I thought Jim was going to.
Mm-hmm. Is he still with us?
I pitched American Promise.
There he is.
We are focused on we call it the 28th Amendment. I realize there's another one kicking around there, the equal rights, but we're, until we have better language, the 28th Amendment, that's American Promise is totally focused on that particular issue. Grassroots organizing state by state. I should add one tiny thing, really good news. Progress in Maine, we got the state's leading pro-gun group, pro-hunter group behind this. So we're working on Susan Collins. This is an example of how you get Republicans on board. You get people that are, You have to talk to them. You can't say no to them. Get people like that on board who can get in the room and get frank, get face to face. So that was a 2-year organizing process to convert Maine's leading Second Amendment pro-gun group on board on our issue. That's the kind of thing that works, or that will work.
Stacy, I think that brings us to conclusion.
I think that does. So again, thanks for everyone. Kari has sent the link out in chat, and I will have post that on the library's YouTube page.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
And we'll wrap it up here.
Thank you, Brad. Thanks, everybody.
Good night,
Bless,
all.
that was awesome.